Picture this. It's 1978, and somewhere in America, a family is gathered around their television set, laughing at the antics of Colonel Robert Hogan and his merry band of prisoners outsmarting their Nazi captors. Hogan's heroes may have ended 7 years earlier, but the reruns were still playing everywhere, keeping Bob Crane's face familiar in millions of homes across the country. But the man behind that charming, wisecracking colonel was living a life that would have shocked those wholesome television audiences. Bob Crane had become something of a fallen star, a cautionary tale about what happens when Hollywood fame fades and darker impulses take over. By 1978, Crane's glory days were behind him. His marriage to his Hogan's Heroes co-star Patricia Olson was crumbling. The Bob Crane Show, his attempt at a comeback in 1974, had crashed and burned after just 14 weeks. Now, at 49, he was reduced to performing in regional dinner theaters, a far cry from the sound stages of CBS. But here's where our story takes a sinister turn. Because Bob Crane wasn't just struggling professionally, he was living a secret life that involved cameras, video equipment, and a disturbing obsession that would ultimately lead to his brutal murder in a Scottsdale apartment. This is your host, Kieran Caldwell, and welcome to Spotlight Murders. If you're drawn to true crime, unsolved mysteries, and the hidden stories behind entertainment's brightest stars, Scoob is the app for you. With AI-powered gripping podcast episodes across crime, history, and pop culture, you can dive deeper into the stories that fascinate you. Download Scoob from the App Store or Play Store and unlock a world of compelling audio storytelling anytime, anywhere. Let's set the scene for what would be Bob Crane's final performance. It's Wednesday evening, June 28th, 1978, at the Windmill Dinner Theater in Scottsdale, Arizona. Crane is starring in a play called Beginner's Luck, an ironic title considering how his luck was about to run out. Something was off that night. Joy Clausen, his co-star, noticed immediately. Bob was extremely tired when he did the show that night, and even acted tired on stage, she would later recall. I had never seen him be that kind of down in a performance before. This wasn't the Bob Crane audiences expected, the energetic, charismatic performer who had charmed television viewers for years. After the show ended at 10:10 p.m., Crane stayed true to his routine. He remained on stage under the spotlight, sharing jokes with the lingering audience members, then invited them to the lobby for autographs. It was here that his enduring fame from Hogan's Heroes still served him well. People loved meeting Colonel Hogan, and Crane loved the attention, especially from the women. But as Crane gathered his belongings backstage around 10:30 p.m., he wasn't alone. John Carpenter, his close friend and frequent companion, had been sitting at the VIP table during the performance. The two men had known each other for years, bonded by a shared interest that went far beyond their professional relationship. As they headed to the parking lot, Crane called out to his co-star Victoria Berry, "Don't forget about our appointment tomorrow. I'll see you at 2 o'clock at my apartment." Those words would prove to be prophetic in the most chilling way possible. Then came the first sign that something was terribly wrong. As they approached Crane's white Monte Carlo, they discovered a flat tire on the right rear. Was this sabotage? Had someone deliberately disabled the car to trap Crane in that parking lot, making him vulnerable to attack? The seemingly innocent flat tire would later become a crucial piece of the puzzle investigators were trying to solve. Fast forward to Thursday afternoon, June 29th, 1978. Victoria Berry arrived at Bob Crane's apartment for their 2 p.m. appointment, probably expecting nothing more than a casual meeting with her co-star. What she found instead would haunt her forever. Picture Victoria's shock as she entered that back bedroom and saw a blood-stained, lifeless body sprawled across the bed. Her mind raced with questions that seemed impossible to process. Was it suicide? Was this really Bob? Could it be his friend John? The scene was so brutal, so unexpected, that she struggled to comprehend what she was witnessing. At 2:22 p.m., Scottsdale police officer Paula Cassieda became the first responder to arrive at what would become one of Arizona's most notorious crime scenes. What she encountered was a nightmare, a body with an inflated head and massive blood loss on the left side of the face. The wound was so severe, she initially thought it might be a gunshot to the neck or mouth. 2 rural metro firefighters arrived next, took one look at the scene, and immediately knew there was nothing they could do. The victim was beyond help. They collected their equipment and left, understanding that this was now a crime scene. Captain John Pratt from the Scottsdale Police Department took command, and slowly the horrifying details began to emerge. The victim was a white male, lying on his right side in a semi-fetal sleeping position. His head rested on a blood-soaked pillow, his left hand tucked under his chin. But the most disturbing detail was around his neck. A black electrical cord with a single right-handed twist, one end with an electrical plug, the other appearing to have been cut from the rest of the cord. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a random act of violence. The lack of any signs of struggle suggested the victim had been caught completely off guard, never having a chance to defend himself. Someone had murdered Bob Crane in the most brutal way possible, and that someone had intimate access to his apartment. When crime scene investigators began their meticulous examination of Bob Crane's apartment, they uncovered clues that painted a disturbing picture of the actor's final hours and his secret life. 3 particular items caught their attention immediately. First, there was a black bag positioned on the bed near Crane's body, both zippers wide open, containing only some papers and tickets. Had the killer been searching for something specific? What had originally been in that bag? Second, investigators found a half-consumed bottle of scotch with the cap removed. Here's the thing that made this significant. Everyone who knew Bob Crane knew he didn't drink scotch. This suggested he'd had company that night, possibly his killer, who had helped himself to a drink while Crane lay dying nearby. The third clue was perhaps the most chilling, that black electrical cord wrapped tightly around Crane's neck. Medical examiner Dr. Heinz Karnichnik determined it had been applied just before or at the moment of death. But here's what made it even more sinister. The authorities concluded the murderer knew Crane was already dead from the brutal head wounds. The cord wasn't meant to kill, it was symbolic. And what a symbol it was. This wasn't just any cord, it had been cut from a television camera's power cable located in Crane's living room. For those who knew about Crane's obsessions, this detail was loaded with meaning. Dr. Karnichnik's examination revealed the true savagery of the attack. Taking an unorthodox approach, he shaved a 4-inch semicircular section around Crane's left ear right there at the crime scene to get a better view of the wounds. In his distinctive German accent, captured on crime scene video, he analyzed the trauma. Well, we've got 2 blows here that are different. The blood spatter patterns told a horrifying story. The minimal blood on the ceiling, caused by the short arc of the second blow, indicated the killer possessed significant strength and could deliver powerful strikes with what was likely a heavy object. The attacker was almost certainly male, and the assault had been swift, brutal, and personal. To understand Bob Crane's murder, we need to dive into the secret life that made him a target. Behind the wholesome image of Colonel Hogan was a man consumed by an obsession that would ultimately destroy him. Crane's descent into this shadowy world had accelerated after his first marriage ended in 1970. His second marriage to Patricia Olson was already strained by 1978, and they were living separately. But it was his partnership with John Carpenter that really defined this dark chapter of his life. John Carpenter wasn't just any friend. He was Crane's enabler, fellow participant, and possibly his eventual killer. Originally a colleague from their early radio days, Carpenter had reinvented himself as the national sales manager for the Akai Corporation. But he strategically aligned his business trips to coincide with Crane's theater performances, joining him toward the end of each run when Crane had already surveyed the local talent. Here's where the story gets particularly disturbing. Crane habitually carried video equipment with him, and he documented his sexual encounters, sometimes with consent, often without the women knowing. He traveled with photo albums filled with Polaroids of different women, each picture annotated with names and descriptions of their sexual activities. It was a twisted trophy collection that he proudly shared with Carpenter. The scope of Crane's activities in Scottsdale was staggering. During his residency there, he reportedly engaged in intimate relationships with at least 8 different women. After each night's performance, he and Carpenter would hit the bars and nightclubs, hunting for female companionship with disturbing efficiency. One woman, cocktail waitress Gail Ann DeRocco, provided investigators with a particularly revealing account of Crane's methods. About a month before his murder, she encountered Crane at the Registry Resort where she worked. He was with Brenda Broyles, a mutual friend and occasional lover of DeRocco's. What happened next illustrates the calculated nature of Crane's predatory behavior. After meeting at the resort, the trio ended up at Crane's apartment, where DeRocco was shocked to find both Crane and Broyles nude when she knocked. She joined them, and before long, Crane had his video camera recording their activities. He also took photographs, promising DeRocco copies, promises that were never kept. This wasn't unusual behavior for Crane. It was his pattern: charm women with his celebrity status, lure them to his apartment, and document everything for his personal collection. DeRocco described him as methodical about it, even playing his sex tapes for her on his VCR, followed bizarrely by an episode of Hogan's Heroes where he pointed himself out. Just 2 days before his murder, Crane called DeRocco with an invitation that revealed the transactional nature of his relationships. He wanted her to join him and his manager, likely Carpenter, for what he suggested could be a threesome. When DeRocco said she'd require payment for such services, Crane declined, worried it could jeopardize his career. The irony is palpable. A man so concerned about his career reputation while living a secret life that was far more scandalous than anything he'd ever done professionally. John Henry Carpenter was more than just Bob Crane's friend. He was his partner in a lifestyle that pushed the boundaries of acceptable behavior, even by 1970 standards. But by June 1978, cracks were showing in their relationship, and those fractures may have led to murder. Carpenter had everything to gain from his friendship with Crane, and everything to lose if it ended. Through Crane's celebrity status, Carpenter gained access to glamorous social circles and attractive women he could never have met on his own. He was living vicariously through a faded television star, and he knew it. But something changed during that final trip to Phoenix. Carpenter had flown in on June 25th for what was officially an Akai Corporation business trip, but really to spend time with Crane. As they drove from Sky Harbor Airport to Scottsdale, Crane showed him that photo album filled with pictures of nude women, his trophies from the road. The dynamic between the two men was complex and unhealthy. Prosecutor Bob Schutz would later argue that Carpenter had become submissive in their relationship, always getting Crane's leftovers when it came to women. The power imbalance was evident in their sexual encounters, with Crane dominating while Carpenter accepted whatever attention was left over. On that final night, June 28th, after Crane's tired performance, the two men went to Bogart's nightclub in Phoenix. They met a woman named Carol Newell and eventually invited Carolyn Bear to join them for breakfast at a restaurant called Safari. But the evening didn't go as planned for either man. Around 2 a.m. on June 29th, they parted ways. Carpenter took Newell back to his hotel room at the Sunburst Motel, hoping for a romantic encounter, but she rejected his advances and asked to be driven home. Meanwhile, Crane struck out with Bohr as well. When Carpenter called to check on his friend's success, Crane reported that his evening had been equally unsuccessful. That phone call may have been the last normal conversation between the two men. What happened in the hours that followed remains a mystery, but by the next afternoon, Bob Crane was dead. Here's where Carpenter's behavior becomes suspicious. When investigators started making calls about Crane's death, Carpenter was strangely detached. During a brief conversation with theater manager Ron Dean, he answered a few questions and left his contact information, but never inquired about the incident or asked about his supposed friend's well-being. For someone who claimed to be unaware of Crane's death, he showed remarkably little concern about why police might be calling. The Scottsdale Police Department knew they had a high-profile case on their hands, and the pressure to solve it was immense. Bob Crane's murder had all the elements of a Hollywood scandal: a beloved television star, a secret life of sexual excess, and a brutal killing that seemed deeply personal. As detectives worked the case, they developed a theory about the murder weapon that would become central to their investigation. Crane was known to travel with video equipment, including camera tripods. Patricia Crane testified that her husband habitually filmed his sexual encounters and always took multiple tripods with him on road trips. But after the murder, only one tripod was found in his apartment. The missing tripod theory gained credibility when forensic investigators conducted a grim experiment. They struck a small photography tripod into a clay model of a human head and found it caused wounds similar to Crane's injuries. Expert witness Rod Englert determined that based on blood spatter patterns, Crane had been struck at least 3 times. The bloodstains on his bedsheet showed 2 slightly inward curving parallel lines, forming a V shape, consistent with a tripod. But perhaps the most damning evidence against Carpenter came from his rental car. When police located the Cordoba he'd been driving, they found tiny blood specks inside the passenger door. Forensic testing revealed the blood type was B, the same as Crane's. While this wasn't definitive proof, about 10% of Americans share that blood type. It was highly suspicious given that Carpenter was supposedly the victim's friend. The investigation revealed other troubling details about Carpenter's background. His estranged son, John Merrill, whom he hadn't spoken to in over 20 years, told investigators that his father had taken up karate for anger management. More disturbing, Merrill claimed Carpenter had admitted to having violent impulses and experiencing tunnel vision, a mental state where he became entirely focused on confronting anyone who provoked him. Susan Martz Williams, a 17-year-old neighbor who lived in Crane's apartment complex, corroborated this violent streak. She told police that Carpenter had once demonstrated his karate abilities near the pool, explaining the philosophy of striking through objects with force rather than simply hitting them. Despite all this circumstantial evidence, the police couldn't build a strong enough case. The blood evidence wasn't conclusive, the missing tripod was never found, and the supposed argument between Crane and Carpenter was based mainly on a waitress's interpretation of their body language. Carpenter maintained his innocence, and without a confession or definitive physical evidence, the case went cold. For John Carpenter, Bob Crane's murder marked the beginning of a nightmare that would last nearly a decade and a half. Though never charged, he lived under a cloud of suspicion that followed him everywhere. The media had essentially convicted him in the court of public opinion, and everyone seemed to know he was the prime suspect in the gruesome murder of America's beloved Colonel Hogan. Carpenter found solace in reconciling with his estranged wife, Diane, and they managed to rebuild their relationship. But he was never allowed to forget that he was suspected of murdering his friend. Every social interaction, every business meeting, every casual encounter was colored by the unspoken question, did he do it? The case remained officially unsolved, but it wasn't forgotten. Cold case investigators periodically reviewed the evidence, looking for new angles or overlooked clues. In the early 1990s, one of these reviews yielded what prosecutors believed was the breakthrough they'd been waiting for. An officer re-examining the numerous photographs taken of Carpenter's rental car noticed something that previous investigators had missed, or perhaps dismissed as insignificant. There was a small speck on the door panel, roughly 1/16 of an inch in size. When forensic pathologists examined this speck more closely, they believed it could be brain tissue. It was a tiny piece of evidence, but potentially enormous in its implications. If this speck was indeed brain tissue from Bob Crane's skull, It would provide the physical evidence needed to finally charge Carpenter with murder. On a day in June 1992, exactly 14 years after Crane's death, the long-awaited knock finally came. Carpenter was arrested for the murder of his friend, and the case that had captivated the public for over a decade was finally going to trial. Carpenter's defense attorney, Gary Fleischman, acknowledged that his client had lived under the shadow of this murder for 14 years. In some ways, both men were relieved that Carpenter's guilt or innocence would finally be put to the test in a court of law. If you're fascinated by true crime and want to keep following the twists and turns of Hollywood's most notorious cases, don't forget to like and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen. Your support helps us bring you more in-depth stories from the dark side of fame and history. When John Carpenter's trial began on September 12, 1994, 16 years after Bob Crane's murder, the prosecution faced a daunting challenge. They had to convince a jury that their tiny speck of brain tissue and decades-old circumstantial evidence were enough to convict a man of murder. Prosecutor Bob Schutz had two main strategies. First, he wanted to establish motive by showing the unhealthy dynamic between Crane and Carpenter. He argued that Crane was growing tired of Carpenter's constant presence and was planning to distance himself from the relationship. This, Schutz contended, motivated Carpenter to violent action when he realized his access to Crane's glamorous lifestyle was about to end. The prosecution's second approach was more controversial. They wanted to show the jury one of Crane's homemade adult films featuring both men and a woman. Schutz had mixed feelings about this strategy. While the video might demonstrate the submissive nature of Carpenter's relationship with Crane, it also risked making Crane look unsympathetic to the jury. Despite vigorous objections from the defense, Judge Martin allowed the screening. For 10 excruciating minutes, the jury watched explicit footage that proved the two men were intimate friends who shared sexual adventures, but did nothing to prove Carpenter's guilt in the murder. The defense, led by Stephen Avila, had a compelling argument. Why would Carpenter kill the goose that laid the golden eggs? His entire social life depended on his friendship with Crane. Without Crane's celebrity status, Carpenter would return to being just another traveling salesman with no access to the lifestyle he'd grown accustomed to. The prosecution's star piece of evidence, that tiny speck on the car door, became the subject of intense debate. Defense experts argued it was impossible to definitively identify the speck as brain tissue, especially since the actual evidence had been destroyed over the years. What the prosecution was asking the jury to accept was essentially a photograph of a speck that might be brain tissue from a murder victim. The missing tripod theory, while compelling, was still just a theory. No murder weapon was ever found, and alternative scenarios were certainly possible. Could a jealous husband or boyfriend have murdered Crane? Could one of his many sexual conquests have discovered his video collection and sought revenge? The defense successfully planted seeds of reasonable doubt. After weeks of testimony, graphic evidence, and emotional arguments, the jury retired to consider John Carpenter's fate. The question they faced was fundamental. Had the prosecution proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Carpenter murdered his friend Bob Crane? The answer, when it came, divided public opinion and left many feeling that justice had been denied. The jury found John Carpenter not guilty of murder. For those who believed in Carpenter's guilt, the verdict was devastating. Here was a man who had motive, opportunity, and whose rental car contained what might have been the victim's blood and brain tissue. His behavior after the murder was suspicious. His background suggested a capacity for violence, and his intimate knowledge of Crane's lifestyle gave him unprecedented access to the victim. But for those who believed in the principle of reasonable doubt, the verdict was correct. The evidence, while suggestive, was largely circumstantial. The brain tissue was never definitively proven to be from Crane. The missing tripod was never found. The supposed argument between the two men was based on subjective interpretation. And most importantly, several other people had motives to kill Bob Crane. The reality is that Bob Crane's lifestyle had made him a target for numerous potential killers. His predatory behavior toward women, his secret recordings, his collection of explicit photographs, any of these could have motivated someone to murder. A jealous husband who discovered Crane's affair with his wife, a woman who learned she'd been secretly recorded, a business partner who felt exploited. The list of potential suspects was long. The prosecution's decision to focus exclusively on Carpenter may have been a mistake. By putting all their resources into proving one theory, they may have overlooked other possibilities or failed to adequately investigate alternative suspects. More than 4 decades after Bob Crane's murder, the case remains officially unsolved. John Carpenter lived the rest of his life as a free man, but the cloud of suspicion never entirely lifted. He died in 1998, taking whatever secrets he may have held to his grave. The questions that haunted investigators continue to puzzle true crime enthusiasts today. Was that flat tire on Crane's car really sabotage, or just an unfortunate coincidence? Why was the electrical cord chosen as a ligature? Was it symbolic, practical, or simply the first thing the killer grabbed? What was originally in that black bag found on Crane's bed? And was the killer searching for something specific? Perhaps most intriguingly, what happened to that missing tripod? If it was indeed the murder weapon, where did it end up? Did the killer dispose of it immediately, or is it still out there somewhere, a silent witness to one of Hollywood's most notorious unsolved murders? The case also raises broader questions about celebrity, sexuality, and the dark side of fame. Bob Crane's secret life was enabled by his celebrity status, but it was also what made him vulnerable. His need to document his conquests, his casual attitude toward consent, his treatment of women as objects to be collected. All of these factors created enemies and motives for murder. There's also the question of justice. Even if we accept that Carpenter was innocent of murder, should there have been consequences for his participation in Crane's predatory lifestyle? What about the women who were filmed without their knowledge or consent? In today's Me Too era, we might view Crane's behavior very differently than audiences did in 1978. Bob Crane's murder stands as one of Hollywood's most enduring mysteries, but it's also a cautionary tale about the price of fame and the dangers of unchecked impulses. The man who brought joy to millions as the wisecracking Colonel Hogan died alone and brutally, a victim of the very lifestyle that gave him pleasure. His death marked the end of an era in some ways, the last gasp of an old Hollywood where stars could maintain secret lives largely hidden from public scrutiny. Today, with social media and constant surveillance, it would be nearly impossible for a celebrity to maintain the kind of elaborate double life that Crane constructed. The case also highlights the challenges facing law enforcement when investigating high-profile crimes. The media attention, the public pressure, the complexity of the victim's lifestyle, all of these factors can complicate an investigation and sometimes lead to tunnel vision that prevents investigators from considering alternative theories. For the Crane family, the murder brought a different kind of notoriety than Bob's television fame had provided. His children had to live with not only the loss of their father, but also the constant reminder of his secret life and the circumstances of his death. The salacious details of the case overshadowed his professional accomplishments and charitable work. The Windmill Dinner Theater, where Crane gave his final performance, became an unwilling part of Hollywood lore. The building still stands today, though it's no longer a dinner theater. Staff and visitors over the years have reported strange occurrences, unexplained sounds, mysterious figures, cold spots. Whether these phenomena are real or simply the product of overactive imaginations influenced by the building's dark history, they serve as a reminder that some places never quite escape their past. As we reach the end of our journey through this dark chapter of Hollywood history, we're left with more questions than answers. The murder of Bob Crane remains officially unsolved, and unless new evidence emerges or someone comes forward with information, It likely always will be. But perhaps that's fitting for a case that was always more about the journey than the destination. The investigation revealed the seedy underbelly of celebrity culture, the complex psychology of obsession and friendship, and the sometimes arbitrary nature of justice. It showed us how a beloved entertainer could live such a drastically different life behind closed doors, and how that secret life could ultimately destroy him. The lesson of Bob Crane's murder isn't just about one man's tragic end. It's about the choices we make and the prices we pay for them. Crane chose to live a life of sexual excess and exploitation, documenting his conquests and treating women as objects. Whether that lifestyle directly led to his murder or simply made him vulnerable to it, it undeniably shaped his fate. Today, Hogan's Heroes still plays in reruns around the world, and new generations discover the charm and humor that made Bob Crane a star. But for those who know the story behind the uniform, there's always that shadow. The knowledge that Colonel Hogan's creator died in circumstances that were anything but heroic. The Bob Crane murder case serves as a reminder that truth is often stranger and more complex than fiction, that justice isn't always served, and that some mysteries are destined to endure long after the principals have left the stage. In the end, Bob Crane got his final curtain call, but it came in a Scottsdale apartment bedroom, not on a theater stage, and the only audience was a killer whose identity remains unknown to this day. Captivated by the shadows where Hollywood glamour meets real-life mystery. Don't let the story end here. Like, subscribe, and follow the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you tune in. Your support helps keep these stories alive and the investigations going. And if you crave even more true crime intrigue, Scoob is your backstage pass to the world's most gripping podcasts. Powered by AI, Scoob curates the best episodes across crime, history, and pop culture, so you'll never miss a twist or a revelation. Download Scoob from the App Store or Play Store and step behind the curtain, because in the world of true crime, the show is never really over.